It's hard to believe how much has changed in just a year. A year ago, I never would have imagined that my life would be the way it is now. In fact, when I look back on everything I went through to get here, I'm still in awe of my own resilience. The path I've taken wasn't easy, and there were moments when I thought I might not make it. But here I am, stronger, more independent, and finally free from the chaos that defined so much of my life. I didn't always have the courage to leave, but now that I've made it to the other side, I'm thankful I did. What I learned over the past year has reshaped me in ways I couldn't have anticipated. When I was younger, my home was never a place where I felt safe or loved. It was more of a battleground, and I was always the one in the middle of it, caught between my mother's emotional manipulation and my father's absence. I used to tell myself that things would get better, that one day I would be able to escape and make my own choices. But for years, I was trapped, both physically and emotionally. My relationship with my mother was always strained. From the earliest memories I can recall, I was always her scapegoat. No matter what I did, it was never enough for her. There were days I would come home from school, eager to share something positive with her, only to be met with her dismissive attitude or harsh criticism. "Why aren't you more like your sister?" she would ask, as if I could somehow be different, as if I could somehow earn her love by changing who I was. My sister, Mandy, was the golden child, always praised, always admired. I could never live up to the version of perfection my mother had in mind for me. It was exhausting. It felt like no matter how hard I tried, I was never good enough in her eyes. And that wasn't just emotional neglect. I started to see how her treatment of me began to shape how I saw myself. The words she used to tear me down sunk deep into my subconscious, affecting my self-worth. But I never showed it, not to anyone, not even to my dad. If there was one person who should have been my ally, it was him. But instead, he chose to remain silent, turning a blind eye to the torment I was enduring. I often wondered why he didn't step in. Why didn't he protect me? Why didn't he stand up to my mom when she was so cruel? My dad was physically there, but emotionally, he was nowhere to be found. He never once challenged my mother, never asked questions when she mistreated me. If anything, he enabled her behavior, thinking it was easier to go along with it than to confront it. I vividly remember how he'd justify my mother's actions. When I was younger, I was desperate to understand why he never stood up for me. I asked him, "Why are you letting mom do this to me?" He would simply reply, "She's your mother, she knows best." That was it. That was the extent of his involvement. He never once considered how it made me feel to hear those words. It wasn't that he didn't see what was happening, but he was more interested in avoiding conflict than in addressing the root of the problem. Money was another factor that strained our relationship. Growing up, my family was always financially strained. My dad worked hard, but it never seemed to be enough. And in his world, any opportunity to save money was worth taking, even if it came at the expense of my happiness. I don't remember a time when we didn't have to pinch pennies, but it was especially painful when it came to my clothes. I remember being made to wear my older sister's hand-me-downs, which, while not inherently bad, carried a heavy emotional weight for me. It wasn't just about wearing clothes that didn't feel like mine, it was the way my mom justified it. "Your sister's clothes are perfectly fine," she'd say. "They'll save us money, and that's what matters." But it wasn't just about the clothes. It was about the message it sent. I wasn't worth investing in. I wasn't important enough to get new things that reflected who I was. My father didn't see the issue. In his mind, it was a simple decision. My mom's thriftiness was just a way of being smart with money. But to me, it felt like a constant reminder that I was lesser than my sister. While she received new clothes and attention, I had to settle for the scraps. But my father's indifference didn't end with my clothes. There were deeper issues at play, particularly when it came to my sister's behavior. Mandy, my older sister, was always the favored child. It wasn't just because of her ability to charm my parents, it was because she could do no wrong in their eyes. While I struggled to find my place in the family, Mandy could do no wrong, no matter how much trouble she caused. And believe me, she caused a lot of trouble. Mandy wasn't just rebellious in the way most teenagers are. She was self-destructive, and that caused a lot of turmoil in her house. She was always getting into trouble, pushing boundaries, and using manipulation to get what she wanted. I remember when she got pregnant unexpectedly. It was a huge shock to all of us, but it seemed to hit my parents especially hard. My dad, despite his earlier indifference to my struggles, suddenly became very involved when it came to Mandy. But even then, he didn't step in to help me. Instead, the family dynamic shifted even further. Mandy's pregnancy became the focal point of their attention. I was pushed further into the background, my own issues disregarded. My dad was financially supportive of Mandy, and my mom was constantly trying to fix things for her. It was as if my own struggles didn't matter compared to the disaster that was unfolding with Mandy. When Mandy got married, unexpectedly, secretly, nobody even told me about it. I found out through extended family members who seemed to have more information than I did. I was living with my grandpa at the time, and he was a source of stability for me. I remember feeling numb when I heard about Mandy's wedding. I didn't care anymore. My parents' drama, my sister's issues, it was all too much. I just wanted to escape, to find a place where I could breathe. Living with Grandpa was a relief. It felt like a safe haven, far away from the emotional chaos at home. But even in that moment of peace, I couldn't escape the looming uncertainty about my future. College was my only hope, and even though I knew it would be my ticket to a better life, I didn't have the resources to make it happen. I didn't have the emotional support from my parents, and I had no idea how I was going to afford tuition, let alone living expenses. It wasn't until my grandpa passed away that I realized how much I had relied on him. His death was a devastating blow, and I found myself spiraling once again. Without him, I had nothing, or so I thought. I soon discovered that my grandfather had left me a small inheritance. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get me started. It covered my college tuition and a place to stay. It wasn't a lot, but it was my lifeline. My father, despite his lack of involvement during my childhood, was legally obligated to provide for my education. After the court decision, he began sending me money as required. It was strange, receiving money from him after so many years of neglect. But I was determined to make the most of it. I enrolled in college and worked part-time to cover my living expenses. I also started tutoring classmates in math, which turned out to be quite a lucrative side gig. Math became my refuge. I was good at it, and it gave me a sense of control and accomplishment that I never felt at home. It wasn't just about earning money. It was about proving to myself that I was capable, that I didn't need anyone's approval to succeed. It was one of the few things I could count on. Over time, my relationship with my father improved. After everything went through the courts, we had to communicate more often. The process of him being obligated to send me money every month made us reconnect, but I didn't trust him completely. He had let me down too many times. Even though we had some good moments, I knew better than to expect too much from him. Meanwhile, my mother and Mandy were still making trouble, but their lives were unraveling in ways I never expected. Mandy got into trouble with the law for running an illegal gambling business. She'd used my grandfather's money to fund her secret business, and it was all seized by the cops when they raided her operation. I felt a sense of satisfaction knowing she had destroyed whatever money she had left. But it wasn't just about revenge. It was about understanding that Mandy had used that money for something so reckless, something so destructive, when it could have been used for good. My father was furious. After the gambling incident, he finally kicked Mandy out of the house. My mother, of course, tried to defend her, but my father had had enough. He laid down an ultimatum. Either Mandy moves out and gets a job, or my mother would have to choose between her and him. My mother, of course, chose my father. And Mandy, despite all her manipulation, was left to fend for herself. It was a long time coming, and I have to admit, I felt a sense of relief. It felt like justice. Mandy and my mother had caused so much pain in my life, but now it was their turn to face the consequences. I wasn't going to help them, not after all they had done to me. And so here I am. I'm not that scared little girl anymore, hiding from the chaos of my home. I'm an independent college student, working hard to build a future for myself. I've learned to lean on myself, and in many ways, I've learned to forgive my father. Our relationship is still a work in progress, but it's better than it used to be. My mother and Mandy, though, they're not a part of my life anymore. And as much as it hurt at the time, it's the best decision I've ever made. I miss my grandpa every day. It's because of him that I'm here today, pursuing my dreams. He may be gone, but I carry him with me every step of the way. I know he's watching over me, and I'm living my life for both of us now. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself slowly adapting to this new chapter of my life. College had become a sanctuary, a place where I could finally breathe without the constant pressure of my past weighing on me. For the first time in years, I was in control of my own life. No longer was I confined by my mother's cruelty or my father's indifference. The people around me at school didn't know my history, and that was both liberating and terrifying. The freedom was intoxicating, but at the same time, it felt like I was walking on a tightrope, unsure of where the next step might take me. I was constantly aware that at any moment, the reality of my past could catch up with me, threatening to undo the fragile peace I had finally built for myself. I was determined to stay focused on my studies, but the emotional scars of my childhood were still there, lurking beneath the surface. It wasn't that I wasn't happy at school. On the contrary, I was thriving academically. But I still had moments when I would be alone in my dorm and the weight of everything would hit me all over again. Sometimes, I'd catch myself staring blankly at the walls, lost in thought, my mind drifting back to the years I spent in that suffocating house. It was during these moments of solitude that I realized just how deeply my family had shaped me. My roommates at school were kind and supportive, but they didn't fully understand the depths of my struggles. It was hard to explain, to put into words the constant fear I'd lived with for so many years. How could they understand what it was like to grow up with a mother who treated you like an inconvenience, or a father who seemed emotionally absent, even when he was physically present? One night, after another exhausting week of studying and working at my part-time job, I found myself sitting with my roommate, Sarah. She had always been the type of person who tried to read between the lines, sensing when something was off. She'd noticed the way I became quiet when certain topics came up or how I would distance myself whenever someone mentioned family. "Is everything okay, Marie?" she asked one evening as we sat in the common room of our dorm building. Her voice was gentle, but there was a sincerity in her eyes that made me feel like she actually cared. "I know you're doing well in school, but I can tell there's something you're not telling me. You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready, but I just want you to know that you can." Her words hit me harder than I anticipated. The floodgates threatened to open, but I held back the tears. I had spent so many years hiding my emotions, pretending that everything was fine, that I wasn't sure how to let someone in. I had spent most of my life keeping my pain buried deep inside, building walls around my heart so high that it was nearly impossible to climb over them. I started, my voice catching in my throat. I wanted to explain it all to her, the constant criticism, the emotional abandonment, the suffocating atmosphere of my childhood home. But the words wouldn't come out. It felt like every time I tried to speak about it, I was opening up a wound that had never fully healed. "I'm not sure where to begin," I said, my voice trembling. "I've had a difficult time with my family. My mom, she's not the easiest person to get along with. And my dad, he's not really there for me in the way I need him to be." Sarah nodded, her expression softening as she listened intently. "You don't have to go into details if you're not ready. But I just want you to know that I'm here for you, no matter what." Her simple offer of support was like a lifeline. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. I wasn't sure if I was ready to fully unpack the emotional baggage I had carried for so long, but it felt comforting to know that someone cared enough to ask. In that moment, I realized that I didn't have to do this alone. I had built walls around myself for so long, but maybe it was time to start letting some of those walls come down. Still, the fear lingered. What if opening up to people meant they would leave me, just like my parents had? What if they saw me as broken, unworthy of their friendship or love? These were the thoughts that plagued me in the quiet moments when I wasn't distracted by schoolwork or my part-time job. As time went on, I began to allow myself to be more vulnerable with Sarah and a few other close friends I had made. It wasn't easy. Every conversation felt like I was chipping away at the walls I had built around my heart, piece by piece. But each time, I felt a little lighter. I started to understand that I didn't have to carry the weight of my past alone. That maybe, just maybe, I could allow myself to be loved, despite everything I had been through. But letting go of the past was harder than I imagined. There were days when I felt like I was making progress, and then suddenly, an old memory would surface. A flash of my mother's cold gaze, or the sound of my father's disinterested voice, would send me spiraling back into that dark place where I was just a frightened child. Those moments of regression were incredibly frustrating, but I also realized that healing wasn't a straight line. It was messy, unpredictable, and at times painful, but it was still progress. One of the hardest things to reconcile was my complicated relationship with my father. After everything that had happened, I wasn't sure where we stood. Part of me still wanted his approval, still craved the validation I had never received as a child. Yet another part of me was angry that he had failed me when I needed him the most. His absence had hurt me in ways I wasn't sure I could ever fully express. The few times I had spoken to him since moving away for college had been awkward and uncomfortable. Our conversations were polite, but there was a noticeable distance between us. He seemed to be trying in his own way, but I couldn't forget the years of neglect, the moments when I had needed him and he had simply turned away. Still, a small part of me hoped that things might change between us. I didn't know if it was because I wanted to believe in the possibility of reconciliation, or if I just longed for the kind of relationship I had always dreamed of having with him. In the spring of my second semester, my father called me. It was a rare occasion, and I immediately felt a wave of nervous anticipation. Was this a chance for us to reconnect? Or was it just another empty conversation? Marie, he began, his voice sounding tentative over the phone. I know we haven't talked much lately, but I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. How's school going? Are you managing okay? I could hear the uncertainty in his voice, and it triggered a mix of emotions in me. I had always wanted him to care, to ask about my life, but I had also spent years convincing myself that it didn't matter. So, when he finally did, I wasn't sure how to react. It's going okay, Dad, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. School's been a lot of work, but I'm handling it. I'm making it through. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could feel the weight of the unspoken words hanging between us. What were we supposed to say? Where were we supposed to go from here? Listen, my father said, his voice growing more earnest. I'm proud of you. I know I haven't always been the best father, but I want you to know that I'm here for you. If you ever need anything at all, I'll help. I want to make things right if I can. His words caught me off guard. I wasn't sure what to feel. Part of me wanted to believe him, to let myself believe that he genuinely wanted to make amends. But another part of me was still so angry, so hurt by everything he had done, or rather everything he hadn't done for so many years. I don't know if you can fix everything, Dad, I said quietly, my voice trembling with emotion. But I appreciate you saying that. I really do. The conversation ended awkwardly, but I hung up feeling a strange mixture of emotions, hope, confusion, and a lingering sense of distrust. Could I truly forgive him? Could we ever rebuild our relationship after everything that had happened? As I reflected on the call, I realized that I had come a long way in my healing. The fact that I could even have that conversation without completely shutting down was a sign of growth. I wasn't the same person I had been a year ago, and I was starting to accept that healing wasn't just about cutting ties or walking away from my past. It was about finding a way to move forward, even if that meant facing the difficult truths and emotions that came with it. And so, I continued my journey, facing the ups and downs of both my academic life and the emotional landscape of my past. As I worked toward my degree, I also worked toward becoming the person I was always meant to be, someone who wasn't defined by the mistakes or limitations of my family, but by my own strength and resilience. The path wasn't easy, but every step I took brought me closer to the person I wanted to become. And for the first time in my life, I was beginning to see that I could create my own narrative. I didn't have to be defined by my past or the people who had failed me. I was finally learning to write my own story. Months passed, and life began to fall into a rhythm. My college work, my part-time job, and the relationships I was building with people who genuinely cared for me helped to stabilize the chaos that had once consumed my world. But even though I had left my old life behind, part of me still couldn't shake the feeling that some unresolved chapter was waiting to be closed. That chapter, of course, was my mother. After everything, I had distanced myself as much as possible. I hadn't heard from her or Mandy in a while, and that was fine by me. The emotional damage they had caused me over the years left scars that I wasn't sure could ever fully heal, but I was learning to live with them. The resentment I felt toward my mother was still raw. She had been the source of so much of my pain, manipulating me, belittling me, and neglecting me when I needed her the most. But sometimes, the universe has a way of forcing you to confront things you've tried to leave behind. It was a cold evening when I received the call. I had just finished a long day at school and was sitting in my dorm, reading a textbook, when my phone buzzed. I almost didn't answer it. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something told me I needed to pick it up. Hello, I answered hesitantly. Marie, a voice replied, sounding strained and upset. It was my father. The sharpness in his tone made my heart sink. There was something in the way he said my name that made me immediately feel that something was wrong. Dad, what's going on? I asked, standing up from my desk. I don't know how to say this. I don't know where to begin, he said, his voice shaky. It's your mother. She's in the hospital. My mind raced. My mother? Hospital? The words didn't make sense. It was the last thing I ever expected to hear. What happened? I asked, already sensing that whatever it was serious. My father paused before he spoke again. She had a heart attack. It came out of nowhere. I think she's not going to make it. The weight of those words hit me like a freight train. My mother, the woman who had tormented me for as long as I could remember, was dying. Despite everything she had put me through, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. There was relief, yes, relief that her hold on my life was finally over. But there was also a deep, nagging sadness. The woman who had once been my mother, who I had so desperately longed for love from, was slipping away, and I was powerless to do anything about it. Is she awake? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She's not responsive, my father replied. The doctors don't think she's going to recover. I'm so sorry, Marie. I didn't want to tell you this over the phone, but I didn't know who else to turn to. I was silent for a long time. The emotions swirling inside me were difficult to process. There was no manual for this kind of moment. My thoughts turned to my mother's behavior over the years, the cruel comments, the manipulation, the emotional abuse. In a twisted way, her passing felt like the final blow of a war I'd been fighting for my entire life. But despite everything, I knew that the death of a parent was a complicated thing. You couldn't simply erase the past. You couldn't just ignore the years spent wishing for love and approval. I'll be there soon, I finally said, my voice breaking. The next few days passed in a blur. I flew back home, my mind in turmoil as I prepared to face the family I had worked so hard to distance myself from. My father was already at the hospital, and when I arrived, I found him sitting in a sterile waiting room, looking older than I remembered. The bags under his eyes were deep, and he was holding a crumpled tissue in his hand. He didn't even look up when I entered. "Dad," I said softly, sitting down beside him. He glanced at me briefly, his face a mixture of exhaustion and guilt. "I don't know what to do, Marie. She's been so difficult all these years, but now that it's really happening, I can't help but feel like I failed her." I didn't know how to respond. My father's guilt was something I had never been able to understand. He had always been a passive participant in the chaos, never stepping in when my mother mistreated me. Yet now, in this moment of crisis, he was consumed by his own regret. "She made her own choices, Dad," I said quietly. "I don't think you're responsible for her actions." He shook his head, tears brimming in his eyes. "I should have done something. I should have protected you. I failed you." The words stung, but I knew they weren't just about me. He was grieving in his own way, trying to come to terms with the years he had spent as an observer in a marriage that was suffocating him, and suffocating me too. When we were finally allowed into my mother's room, the sight was almost surreal. My mother, once so vibrant and full of venom, now lay in the hospital bed, pale and fragile. The woman who had torn me down at every opportunity, who had taken so much from me, was now at the mercy of a cruel, unpredictable fate. There was no malice in her now, no harsh words, no manipulation. Just the haunting silence of a life that had never known peace. I stood there, frozen for a moment, unsure of what to feel. My father reached for her hand, but she didn't respond. I could see the tears glistening in his eyes as he whispered something I couldn't hear. "Do you want to say anything to her?" he asked me, his voice trembling. I shook my head, unable to speak. I wanted to, but the words felt too big, too complicated. There was nothing left to say to her. Not after all these years. A few hours later, my mother passed away quietly in her sleep. There were no dramatic last words, no final moments of reconciliation. It was just over. The funeral was a quiet affair, with only a few relatives and close family members in attendance. My father's grief was palpable, but it was mixed with a sense of relief. Relief that the toxic dynamic that had defined their marriage was finally over. Mandy wasn't present. I later learned she was in hiding after the scandals surrounding her gambling business had made headlines. My mother's death, though tragic, seemed to do little to change her course. In the aftermath, I tried to make sense of everything. My mother's death, though tragic in its own way, didn't undo the damage she had done to me. But it did bring a kind of closure. It was as though the final thread that tied me to my past had been severed, and I was free to move forward without her looming over me. The tragedy of my mother's life, and ultimately her death, was that she had never learned to love. She had spent her years building walls around her heart, pushing away anyone who tried to get close. In the end, she had no one left but my father, who had long since resigned himself to being a passive observer in her life. And in her final days, she had no one who could truly help her. No one who could give her the love and forgiveness she had never learned to give to herself or anyone else. I left the funeral with a strange sense of peace. I had come full circle. My life wasn't perfect and there was still much I had to work through, but I was no longer bound by the past. The woman who had tormented me, who had made my childhood a living hell, was gone. And with her passing, I realized that I no longer needed to carry the weight of her cruelty with me. The tragic end of my mother, a woman who had never truly known love, was a reminder that the bitterness we hold on to only ends up consuming us. In her final moments, my mother was alone, as she had chosen to be, and for the first time, I felt a sense of empathy for her. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was understanding. She had been lost long before she passed away. As for me, I was finally free. I could now focus on building the life I had always dreamed of, one where I could love and be loved in return, one where I wasn't defined by the past. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, I felt ready to face it. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit notification bell to stay updated.